Well, hello folks, and welcome to episode 145 of Retro Power Uncut. And we are starting in quite a lot of carnage today, as you'll see as we walk around. We're doing a bit of strip down. We've been doing an awful lot of strip down the last couple of weeks. But we're going to start here with the Mark II Jag Coupe Churchill project, which is steadily progressing through metal finishing. I told you before it was going to be a long slog. It's going to be a long slog, probably proving to be an even longer slog than we thought it might be. So yeah, there's not a huge amount to say on this really. Tom's just gradually battling through one panel at a time, doing various bits of reshaping, various bits of adjustment of shape, and getting everything to a stage where we are in a position to be able to do some lead work on it. The other task that we have yet to address, which kind of ties into that, is we've still got to modify the front wheel arches. And to that end, we need to quantify exactly what the modifications are that have got to be done to those. And in order to do that, we are going to use some clay, some Chavant NSP clay, which is kind of commonly used for that sort of job. And we'll do a bit of clay modelling on the front wing, or one of the front wings on this car, so I think Cal's going to do that, or Cal and George between them will do that, to get to work out a shape that we like. It's quite hard on a Mark II Jag wing. They're a slightly odd shape from the factory, and trying to work out a neat way of doing a wing flare is quite critical. So we're going to model that in clay, so we can take some profiles off it, probably scan it just so we've got a digital record as well. Then we can do some profiles and then use those profiles to actually create the metalwork alterations. Whether we can actually stretch those into the existing wings or make new sections and graft them in remains to be seen, because it depends how much shape we've got to put into them. It'll probably be a case of grafting some pieces in, but that is all for the future. So moving on from Churchill. Oh, sorry, yes, as usual I'm forgetting things. Jamie has just reminded me, other very important thing is that Stu, having been away for a while, is back, and he is picking up the work on the door tops. I talked about the brass frames before. I'm just looking now to see if Stu has left me one somewhere. Jamie will put some footage in so you'll be able to see it on that. We have elected, having gathered enough pieces together and definitely bottomed out you'll remember from previous episodes, bottomed out the potential of being able to get the original extrusion, which we can't. So we are now going with the route of piecing together two sections of extrusion from other doors. We've worked out that we can do all of the rest of the front door frame from existing pieces. So it isn't worth machining it all from billet. So we are grafting the top section, we're grafting together from two pieces. We've done some trials, mitering and brazing those two sections together, and then doing some destructive testing on them just to make sure that they are pretty strong. I haven't quantified it in number of kilograms to deflect, but basically we put a piece of pipe on it and bent it in a vise until it snapped, and decided whether we were happy with the strength of it or not. And interestingly, as another little offshoot, that we discovered that the brass alloy, again somebody will advise me on this I imagine online, but the brass alloy involved in those door frames is not, as far as I can determine, not a zinc containing brass alloy, which is slightly odd. So it's not a normal brass. It appears, we've tried gas brazing it with a normal, I can't remember the name of the alloy, but a normal brass brazing rod, which it brazed okay. But TIG brazing is a lot more accurate and neat. We've actually tried TIG brazing it with our Sifsil copper 968 rod, which is almost a pure copper. It's a copper silicon alloy, it's silicon bronze as people would call it. And it actually TIG brazes fine. And strangely, you can't normally TIG braze conventional brass sections because the zinc boils off and creates a problem. Well, there was no zinc issue with that brass. So I think it's, I don't know what kind of brass it is, but it TIG brazes, interestingly. So that's how we've actually joined them. We've TIG brazed the sections together, then followed them and shaped them and made sure that the shape is exactly accurate through the weld, through the braze point. So there's no change of section there, no change of line where the joins are. Stu's got all that done. The next phase really is that he's going to do the section that sits on top of the door at the bottom of the window opening. He's got to make those, which he's working on here, make those in steel, and then he'll get those brazed into the frame as well. And at that point, before that's brazed into the frame, we're going to get the frames chrome stripped. So that we can then work on the rest of the frame without having to grind through chrome, because most of the rest of it we don't want to do any grinding on really. The surface is already pretty good on it, so we just want to chrome strip it. Then we can braze the top on, braze the bottom strip on, then do all the finishing on it, and then that can go off the final chroming once we've done a final fit up on the car. So that's the sort of chain of events with the door tops, door window tops. Moving on from that, now we will move on to Allegro, where Bobby is very busy. Most of the progress has been on the other side of the car, but the area he's working on is the inner wing reinforcer rail that goes along here, and you can see he's got the top section in place on this side. He's been shaping that to fit. He's now shaping up the large strengthening box that comes along here. He's done the other side of the car, shaped all the steel up for that, put the reinforcing ribs into it, put the drain holes in it in the appropriate places, epoxy coated all the insides of that, got all that welded in place, and that side is now done. So now moved on to this side. Because we've had a week's gap, there's obviously things have jumped ahead quite a bit, and another bit I don't think we'd covered before was the fact that we've done the wing mounting rails. The wings are going to be carbon fibre, as we've mentioned before. Decided to do the wing mounting rails from a lightly rolled piece of oval tubing. We've used some 30mm by 15mm ovalised 16 gauge mild steel tubing, which we're going to put threaded inserts into, so we can bolt the wings down onto that, and then this structure will be stitch welded to that tube. But that tube means that we can neatly bridge this section at the front where the indicator unit, well the indicator and side light unit would normally go. That will be having an indicator in it. We'll be doing that unit in aluminium billet, and that will also be an air intake to feed cold air into the engine bay to get cold air to the throttle bodies. In order to do that, we need a big hole to feed that air through. And by the time you've put a big enough hole through the inner wing here, there's not really any inner wing left. So we decided to bridge that area with this piece of tube just to feed the strength into the front panel. Not that that needs to be particularly strong, but just to feed the strength down into that, we're using that piece of tube and then building the surround here. This surround is being done. There'll be another piece up on top of here. This is all being done so that we can put an edge trim onto that, like a boot seal, a trunk seal as the Americans would call it, onto that edge, and then that will, when the carbon fibre wing goes on, that will seal against the inside of the carbon and just form a nice seal there, stop dirt coming into the inner wing area. So that's what's gone on there. Again, I think subsequent to the last video, the slight complication is I was also away last week, so some of this is me trying to remember where things were at before I went away. The rear seats are Integra rear seats, and Scott has put those in so that he could get on with working out the parcel shelf position and the parcel shelf. Now that, amazingly, the Integra rear seats fit perfectly inside the Allegro. There's actually a slight gap around them because the sides of the Allegro are so much thinner. There's actually a little bit of a gap around them. But that will be taken up by the thickness of the door card, the inside quarter cards that we make for the inside the back of the car. So that won't be a problem. But those Integra seats actually fit perfectly, so it's all worked out really surprisingly well. The difference will be obviously with the shortening of the wheelbase, the shortening of the floor pan, the rear seat footroom will basically be non-existent. That's not particularly unusual for cars of the 1970s era. We've built a few cars before. I mean, the one that sticks in my mind the most would be the W111 Mercedes, where when I was doing all the structural work on that, on the jig in here, I thought I'd got some measurements wrong somewhere. I thought I'd got something drastically wrong, because in the rearmost position, which, given the stature of the driver of that car, he's a big, physically large framed chap, he will have the seat a long way back, and the bit I couldn't get my head around is that the front seats are basically touching the back seats. But that's how I then went through lots of photos of W111 coupes in an assembled condition, and that is just how the seats are in them. So this won't be particularly unusual in that. But yes, it's not primarily being built for rear seat passengers, which is just as well, because the rear footwell room will be quite limited. Other than that, all progressing very nicely. Further work to that is George is cracking on with the CAD work, but I'll let Cal mention that when he picks up next door. because that's going to really be that's the bottleneck process on the build of the two Austin Allegros. We'll touch on the next one in a minute. The bottleneck process on both of them is going to be the carbon work, because we have to do the CAD work to generate the shapes we're happy with and the surfaces for the wheel arches and wings and everything. Then we have to, once we're completely happy with that and we've made sure that everything's going to fit the car properly, then we have to get the tooling designed and made, and then the carbon parts made, and then fit them. That's the quarter panels, front wings, bonnet and boot. Bonnet and boot will be actually just taken as moulds from the original panels. The rest will be done from CAD. At that point, we then have to rescan, because we have the front spoiler and the side skirts to do, and I don't want to tool them until we've got the quarters and wings on, so that we can rescan to get the exact profile for those. So there's quite a lag, quite a time lag on the projects there. So we really do need to get the carbon tooling underway, so that we can get on that, because the metal work on this car is going to be finished a long way ahead of that tooling being done. So that's where we're at on that. I'll march on over here and we'll look at the E-Type. I'm not going to really be able to point very accurately at it, but subsequent to the last video, you'll notice that the E-Type is now fixtured to the jig. After toing and froing a little bit on the exact plans of action, we've decided to fixture it to the jig. So Bobby and Sam made those fixtures up tail end of the week before last and last week. Got the fixtures made so that the car's all held in a true state on the jig. Everything's exactly on centre line, everything's level, everything's where it needs to be. So Sam's now cracking back on with the sheet metal work on that, and he's working on doing the floor on the far side. The decision was also made at the point of, it tied into the decision to put the car on the jig. The decision was made to add significant reinforcement to the sill structures on this car by adding 4-inch 16-gauge tubing through the sills internally, tied into the bulkhead pickup and tied into the rear suspension pickup area, just to add a chunk of strength to the car, because they're not a particularly strong tub, the E-Type body tub. So Sam's been beavering away on that, getting the tube in on that side and all the gussets and mountings in place on that side. And obviously, having detached the outer sill to be able to do that, we now have new outer sills to go on to replace the removed outers. But he's now working on getting the floor pan put back in, which is where we were a few weeks back. So he's just getting he's finished cleaning up, doing any edge repairs around where the floor pan's got to go in, and he's just at the point of marking up the floor pan and sectioning it. You may recall from before, we've got to where we've widened the shoulders, the lower shoulders on the transmission tunnel. Sam's got to narrow the floor pan in that area, and then narrowing the floor pan is going to mean he's got to refinish all of the reinforcement flutes in the floor pan, shorten them all, flatten them out, shrink the metal in that area so that it doesn't all go wavy, and then reprofile the edge of the floor so that it clears that reprofiled transmission tunnel. So that's what Sam's up to on this, but yeah, that's coming along very nicely. Some really nice structural work. Really happy now it's all on the jig. As I say, the other reason for doing the jig is that once the floors and sills are complete, we're going to be removing the entirety of the rear bodywork, the rear outer bodywork, because that again is going to be replaced with carbon, and we didn't really want to be doing that with no datums held on the car in reasonably accurate positions. So that's what's going on there. Round just out of camera here, Mark is just completing strip down on another E30 M3 Redux build, which has just arrived. So that's what's occurring there, is the initial running gear strip down on that. It's a fairly careful process. Well, obviously it's a careful process, but it's fairly careful in that there are a number of parts we have to keep, and there are a number of parts that we don't have to keep for the final build, but that need keeping for stock for the future. There's a whole routing of various parts in various directions that has to go on at the point that this car's dismantled. So that Mark's dealing with all that and bagging and tagging all the bits, and then they'll be all farmed in their various directions for storage or rebuilding, depending on what's going on with the various parts. So that's what's going on there. Then walk past a large skip full of metal, which is what has just been, other than those two bits, which would scrap lying around, that's all material that has just been removed from this, which is the second Honda Integra DC2, which is now fixtured to the jig. I believe in the last episode of Uncut you saw this getting stripped, all the seams to get removed and blasted. It then sat sort of parked in the workshop just on top of the jig for a week while I was away on holiday. And then now I've come back from holiday this week, I've started work on getting the body shell stripped down and in a position where we can get it shortened initially. It's the first job. Got to take the 130 millimeters out of the floor here, roughly, slide the car back together, do all the metalwork associated with that, and then all of the other bits of metalwork associated with building the sill structures, building the inner wing, modifications, and then in parallel with that, well, in fact, no, the week before, last week, the other Allegro arrived, the second Allegro arrived, a lovely brown machine. Now, we weren't particularly confident about the condition of the second car in terms of rust. Well, for once, unusually, that lack of confidence was misplaced, because if anything, it seems to be better than the first car, amazingly. So that car, that was stripped down completely last week and is now sat on a trolley out of the way. Once the work is done on the floor pan, bulkheads and all the Integra half of the structure, then we'll dissect the Allegro, ready to apply the Allegro to the Integra in the same way as you've seen happen on the first car. So as I mentioned before, trying to do these in reasonably quick succession so that we don't forget all the detail work that's gone on, because there's quite a lot. I mean, looking at camera now, the area of the A-pillar, or where the A-pillar should be and isn't currently, that area, there's a reasonably technical bit of fabrication around there to amalgamate the two structures and incorporate all the required strength into that area. And some of it isn't sort of, measure 200 mil in the x-axis and 500 mil in the y-axis and yada yada yada. There's a few slightly artistic bits of metalwork required in there, and Scott will have most of that still in his head, hopefully. He's away this week, but hopefully he'll have most of that in his head, and between Scott and Bobby they'll remember most of the work that was done on the first car because it's still going on. So it should be reasonably fresh to then apply that work to this car. So what I've been doing the last 2 days is basically peeling all the structure that we don't need off this, and that's what that skip over, the wheelie skip in the middle of the workshop, is full of everything that's just been cut off this. Some of that's rough cut work, some of that's tidy cut work, some of it was rough and then tidied up afterwards. So, for example, the front panel removal is just at a rough stage at the moment. That was just plasma cut off well to the safe side of the final cut line. Then we'll use a laser to project the final cut lines on accurately based on the CAD, then cut to that laser line like we did with the first car so that we know that's exactly correct. Same with the rear of the boot floor. I haven't even done a rough cut on that because the amount of material removed from the back is actually quite minimal. The centre structure I'm about to scribe out into the floor, exactly where we've got to put all the cut lines into this to do the shortening process. And it's actually, I think we touched on it before, but you can see quite clearly where Honda mated this floor pan on their production line. You can see the lead-ins on these two sections on the inner sill here, and the way they interlock over each other. That's where the two halves of the floor were actually mated in production at this join line, and the sill sections were joined there. So it's not an unusual process to do that mating process, as long as the parts are designed correctly to do it. So that's why I carefully picked the join lines that we're going to carry out, that we will do on the floor pan, are done sympathetically with all the suitable points in the floor to do that joining. So basically, once it's done, you won't know it's ever been done. So that's where we're at on that. The other Allegro, once the metalwork is progressed a little bit further on, there's a couple of jobs left to do, including removing the quarter panels. Once they're removed, we can just finish off the rear sill structures. Once that's done, we'll be on to some dry build work. We now have the throttle body kit, the manifold SF type taper throttle bodies and the air horns and the linkage kit and various other bits and bobs from Genv Dynamics. So they will be bolted onto our mock-up B18 C6 engine that's just up on the mezzanine up there. That'll come down and that'll be mocked up into the first, the Project Lucky Strike Allegro, the first Allegro. The engine from this car, from this Integra, is in our engine room. That's completely stripped down of ancillaries down to gearbox, basically gearbox casing, engine block and head, basically the core assembly, so that we, at some point, when we can move that into proceedings, can get on with the rebuild work on that as well, in parallel with building the cars, just to try and get a little bit ahead on the later work on the vehicle. So I think that pretty much sums up where we're at on that, without me waffling on for too long, as I always do. And then final stage from this side is to head over this way and into the Dust Emporium, into Gaz's Misery Emporium, where the astute have noticed the wall titling. We actually had that, Cal had that number plate made up for our trimmer, as it happens, for one of his vehicles that had persistent reliability issues. So as sympathetic as we always were, we made him a nice number plate to relieve his misery. But as you can see here, we're doing filling and sanding. So this is yesterday afternoon, had its first coat of polyester. Yeah. So had its first coat of polyester, spray filler yesterday afternoon, guide coat on it. There was quite a lot of skim work, as you'd seen in previous episodes, done in localised areas all over the quarters, rear panel. Don't think any was done on the roof. They've gone, Gaz has gone for trying to do polyester only on the roof. I think it's looking pretty close by the looks of that. A couple of little bits. I can see a little bit of dolphin glaze, but it looked pretty decent actually, reasonable anyway. A bit of a skim at the front by the looks of things. But yeah, so trying to go heavily with polyester rather than do lots and lots of chasing your tail doing patch skims. So that's looking reasonably close by the looks of things. And then yeah, onto the quarter panels. And the really challenging area, as you can see by the dark line around the wheel arch, is keeping this area accurate, which is really quite difficult when blocking the relatively flat section here into the compound curve of the wheel arch, and keeping that swage line accurate when realistically on something like this polyester, one sweep with the block can move, one sweep with that block when you're working on that swage line can move the swage line by 4 mil. There's an awful lot of care involved in trying to keep those areas accurate, so it's quite a painstaking process. So anybody who's done it will realise that those who haven't may not realise quite how fiddly those sort of bits can be. But yeah, that's where we're at with that. Proceeding along with things. In tandem with that, we've got to get the front wings on, get the coating on the back of those. Been a slight hiccup in that we've had a pain in the ass of a problem with a door hinge, so I've got to get that rectified. Not going to go into all infinite detail on that, other than that the Misery Emporium is an accurate description. But we've got to resolve that before we can get the wings fitted. So I've got to deal with that door hinge and sort that out. It's kicked us where we weren't expecting it, that one, but we'll get it fixed. So yeah, that pretty much sums up where we're at on the dirty side of the building. And I think at that point we'll hand over to Cal and let him run through what's going on in the assembly shop.
Right, thank you, Nat. I am going to start with Camaro. Anthony, standing right behind me, is just working on the grille. So we got a load of parts back from anodising. I think they were sent away last week, so the usual good turnaround from Beaufran Anodising, who we use. And we're going to be able to assemble the grille assembly. So it actually ended up being quite a convoluted selection of parts to get exactly the look we wanted, solve various problems. One was accessing things in the right order to actually be able to put everything together to get bolts in. Another was the fact that the plastic grille surround off the original car was kind of wavy and didn't really hold a straight line. So we came up with this system where we've actually got aluminium channels now on here that are anodised, and then there's a drilled and tapped plate on the back. In fact, I've got one here that I can show you, which clamps on the back, and basically there are little bolts countersunk into the inside of the channels that bolt through to the plate on the back, which then pulls all the plastic nice and straight, gets rid of that problem, and gives us a little channel that we can then slide the grill meshes into. So, which means we can get to the bolts to bolt that surround in, then slide the meshes in, and then the central rib goes in after, which holds the badge in the middle. That finishes it off nicely. That's been anodised as well. And then there's a similar system for the bottom. So actually already fitted in here, there's another aluminium channel that's actually been formed to a slight V to match the shape of the car. It's got a little tab welded on each side, which screws into the original bodywork on the back in the original mounting points. And then there's an upper channel with a tab on it, which screws in here. So then the last kind of bolts are the ones that go, which are accessible here. And then similar deal again with the meshes, they just sit into these channels. So the culmination of all that being that it's nice sort of honeycomb plastic grille, nice black anodised aluminium all around it, no fasteners that are visible. So yeah, really excited to see that taking shape. We've also done the badge design for this, which I think is off now being machined by Andy. So we basically took the RS or SS badge style or font style from the slightly later Camaros, and then we've changed it to the RP. So that's being machined as a little aluminium piece, and we'll infill that. I think we could probably infill it with the body colour or maybe a bronze colour to match the wheels. I haven't made a final decision on that. So we'll just have the sort of original style Chevy badge in the middle and then the RP badge over to one side. Also on this, Luke's been working on the fill tank, if you like, for the screen wash and clutch fluid, which is, on this side we've got the master cylinder coming through, which is the front and rear brake fluid fills, and then the intention was that we were always going to make a matching reservoir that side. This one's actually part of the brake master cylinder. The other one, we're designing our own tank that completely replicates that. We've actually bought the top panel and the caps from Bear, who make the brake system, so it matches perfectly, but we're machining the reservoir that goes onto. So it's done that, I've done a 3D print prototype, which looks perfect, and then that's going to bolt in and have unions in the bottom that feed a larger, especially a fill tank, that will feed a larger screen wash tank under the inner wing, and then the pipework goes across to the clutch master cylinder from there for the clutch fluid. So that's all falling into place nicely. I think in the run up to getting this all ready to actually get the grille fitted, Anthony was also working on just the last bits of air conditioning plumbing. So John had made the pipes up previously, he's just crimped all those up now, done a bracket for the air conditioning dryer, and he's made a shield as well. We did similar this side for the oil filter, but we've made a shield so the road debris can't come forward and damage the aircon dryer. So essentially everything in here is buttoned up now. We've just got the air filter to go on and the airflow meter goes in here. We also Xylan coated the stainless Jubilee clips just so that they weren't so obvious through the grille. We were mulling over for ages whether to do the radiator black as well, but kind of ummed and ahed about it, and I think Anthony and I both shared the same view that actually some view of kind of mechanical parts gives it a slightly menacing presence through the front, so it does look pretty smart. But I think the Jubilee clips visibles, sort of silver through the grille, is never a good look, so we've done those black. But yeah, excited to see all that coming together. Squeeze over this way, and you'll see main thing, the workshop being incredibly full. But one of the reasons for that, Stratos is now back from its little shakedown session. Just cracking ahead with that. There were various things we hadn't finished before the owner had it back this time. He just happened to be back in the country, so wanted to have use of it for a bit. But we still needed to commission the air conditioning system. There were a couple of pipes left to make on that, so we're doing that now. We still had some further mapping work to do, mainly around cold start idle control. And then there was one thing kind of from his use of it that he's pointed out, we'd never checked it for water tightness, and he got caught out in an absolutely torrential rainstorm. And it does need some bits sealing up. Some of the window seals around the corners aren't quite working as they should. There's one thing which is a bit of I'm not entirely sure, I've got some ideas of how to solve it, but it's kind of a bit of a flaw with the Stratos design, is that obviously on most cars, water running down the window will end up inside the door and drain out to the bottom. Now, there were no drain holes in these doors. That's an easy fix. We can drill them so water comes out. But the problem is, because the shape of the door and the fact that there's the window mechanism is just a knob on the end of a stud on the glass, which goes through a slot in the door card, kind of means that any water that runs down the window ends up sort of accumulating around that slider and actually dripping through the slider onto the inside of the door card. Now, normally in a car you'd put a membrane on the inside of the door and that would guide the water down, but of course there's got to be a slit in it for where the actual adjustment knob goes. So I think we're going to come up with a little kind of gutter system that sits on the back of the door card, which is fiberglass anyway, which guides the runoff from the window sort of forwards and down to the bottom of the door, and then it'll come out the drain holes. So that was not something we'd got to the point of testing yet, but in general, awesome thing. Certainly not one I'd want to take out regularly in the wet anyway, but yeah, he had fun with it. I think he was just glad to have some use of it for a little bit, so we're going to rattle through the remaining jobs on that now and see how we go. Utah, the oil pressure sender turned up, replaced that, that's fine now. There were just a couple of other little things we were going to address on this. This mirror is having a tendency to come out of adjustment, and where we machine the sort of mount for it, the actual mirror itself, I think it's like a Tex mirror or something, it's a standard sort of off-the-shelf item. And they come with this little plastic sort of semi-spherical washer in there, which is kind of forms a ball joint type arrangement that gives you the adjustment, and no matter what you do, it always seems to work its way back to being flat. So I think it's just that there's the plastic's effectively lubricating it too much, just regardless of how tight you do it. So I think we're going to make a little stainless steel version of that, which should solve that. And then one other thing on this, the passenger heated seats failed, which they are XJ40 Daimler seats, which are really nice. We've used them on quite a few projects. They just kind of have a lot of electrical function, but look quite in keeping in an old car. However, they have a little pressure sensor on the heat elements. Actually, the heating elements are amazing on them. It goes all around the sort of perimeter of the bolster at the bottom, and the main section in the middle, and on the back. So they're really good. I think the actual heating elements are from a Swedish company, and they should know how to do heating elements for seats. However, there's a pressure sender on there, which means they only operate when you're sitting on it. And I think because they're donor seats from a much older car, one of those pressure senders has failed. So we're just bypassing those because we've got a timer on there anyway, which means that when you turn the heated seat on, it only stays on for a certain amount of time, regardless of whether you leave the switch on or off anyway. You'd have to toggle it off and on again. So there's not really a problem with the seats just continuously being on, and they go off with the ignition as well. So yeah, going to sort that, and that's then good to go. Mustang, just been rattling through some little sort of niggle jobs on that. The door handle problem we've solved, which is a problem with one of the linkages on the handle. There's a little bit of a problem with the door cards having a tendency to pop off, and it's again dealing with basically suboptimal, as we'd say, aftermarket parts. So the door cards are just new aftermarket ones. The shape of them is slightly big, so where they're supposed to sit into a slight recess in the metalwork of the door, they're just sitting onto it slightly, which pulls them out a fractionally more. And then the clips are some horrible like wire clip that has to kind of go, it's like a shape like this, and it has to go over center, if you like. The card has to go, the clip has to go past the metal of the door for it to be the other side of the bump, if that's in simple terms. But because they're held off slightly, they're kind of hanging on the bump and not going on properly. So we're going to change all the door clips on that to a type where it kind of grips in any position, and have little plastic. They're like VW type ones, so there'll be plastic inserts in the holes in the door, and then a kind of an expanding clip which can grip in multiple positions, which will hopefully solve that problem. And then we've got a little oil leak on that, on the transmission. So we've looked at the gearbox was built elsewhere, but it seems to have a leak on the band tension adjuster screws. So we've looked at resealing those. Going to take it out and give it another run and see if that sorts that. But yeah, going in the right direction on the nitpicking on that. Morris, happy to report that the brakes, although I think last week I said sort of we'd changed the whole remote servo assembly, but the problem of the pedal feel being slightly odd remained. Now Adam was only kind of assessing that while using his hand on the pedal and thought it still felt the same. However, I went out for a test drive in it and it's absolutely fine now. So very happy to report that brake pedal feel fine now. The only remaining mechanical niggle I was reporting on test drives was there was a slight vibration from somewhere on the body when you were on the overrun, which we thought maybe the exhaust contacting something, because we've left the engine on fairly soft mounts on this to try and give it a good level of refinement. And yeah, we had a bit of an inspection, and the exhaust was just vibrating on actually one of the bell housing bolts. So it wasn't even the relative movement of the engine, it was just that because there's a bit of movement in the exhaust in certain positions, it was just vibrating on the head of a bolt on a bell housing. So we've literally just swapped that from a cap head to a dome head, and that's given us sort of 4 or 5 mil clearance. Test drove it again, really happy with it now, like no mechanical faults. So good to drive. I've thought that every time I've driven it. You know, the controls feel fantastic. Everything about it, gearbox, clutch, steering, suspension, it just feels a very composed package. So we're just now buttoning up a few last little things. I've got to get the revised, waiting for the revised seatbelt guides to be machined, because I think I mentioned before they kind of snag slightly. James is just doing a revision on the centre console, that's why that's out. We realised that the electric window buttons, the terminals on one side, were very close to the sort of raised section of the gearbox shifter area, and we were worried that in certain movements it could actually contact and short the terminals. So we've just, those switches that we've used could be fitted in 2 ways. They can be fitted with a slight spacer ring behind, or you put the spacer ring on the back and have them flush. So we're just swapping them to having the spacers on the front, so there'll be slightly raised buttons, but it'll give us 10 mil of clearance on there, or 10 mil more than there was. So yeah, tickling through those things, and I think pending getting that lot back together and getting a good chunk of miles on it, now I'm happy with everything mechanically, I think we're going to be pretty much at handover point on that, so that is good. Escort, getting very close to getting this rolling. I think I said that last time. Carrying on with some design stuff. Alex actually has been on with something, carrying on with the electrical planning. He's designed a little CAN bus sort of module, if you like, for it, where normally, because everything's on CAN bus system, the Motec engine management, Motec PDM, the battery isolator, I feel like there was something else on there as well. They're effectively all on a CAN bus, and normally, you know, you've got to splice the wires together for that, and once it's all in place, you've got no way of individually singling out buses, the CAN communication for individual devices, because they're all on the same bus. And we thought it'd be quite cool to actually create a little module whereby the CAN wires from each component separately enter that module via a plug, which means we can then, if we wanted to, separately diagnose individual CAN circuits. It also means we can have a nice point to have our communications port. So we've got an Ethernet connection in there, so we can have that plugged directly into this little CAN splice box, if you like. And also the resistors that are needed on the CAN communication wires are integral with that. So they're on a little printed circuit board we're making for it. So basically it was just a nice, neat way of bringing all of the different CAN communication wires together in a little box that just makes it a bit more of a flexible and future-proof system than just putting them all together in the loom. So that's looking good. I feel like Luke's been doing something on this, and I can't think for the life of me, despite having asked just before I came down here, what he was on with. I think we saw the door mirrors last week, so perhaps not. But yeah, we're waiting for the struts back from Nitron. One of the things we did when we spec'd struts was we wanted the hoses for the reservoirs to be very long, so when we did our mock-up build we could identify what size they needed to be with the reservoir held in position, and then get them to change the sizes of the hoses. So now Kuma's threw in the body shop and finished its dry build. That freed up that first set of struts for us to send them off to Nitron. So they're at the moment just editing the sizes of the hoses, and I believe that is the last thing we need for it to be rolling. So I would say next week, if we get those back, we've got all the components in place now, subframe wise. We've got the diff and subframe going together, front subframe's all ready to go, all the suspension arms are ready to go, top mounts are ready to go. So yeah, we can just get that in and get it rolling, I think. So hopefully next week be rolling. Rich has been on with the Dynamat, so he's finished that now. It's all Dynamated for sound and heat insulation, but primarily sound. Stops a lot of the drumming noise, a lot of the road noise. Also with us having an audio system, it's nice to get the road noise down, but also it stops some of the resonance from the sound system. And then on top of that, but at a later date, we'll be doing Dynaliner, which is like a foam sound deadening, which will go on top of that, and that kind of really ups that sound deadening level. But it is, when you're working on the car, it's quite easy to damage it because it's quite a soft foam, so we tend to leave that until much further down the line. So can get all the wiring in, get all the interior up to the point of putting the carpets in, and then do the dyno liner sort of towards the end. So yeah, very excited that we're about at the point of starting to put this together, which hopefully will go reasonably smoothly. Land Cruiser, I think we probably have not got a lot of news since last week. Oh, the airbox. That's one thing that arrived this week. We were trying to think of a nice way of doing a more retro-looking airbox. We had an Edelbrock filter, which was just a pancake filter on there with the filter element visible and just a pressed top on it. We thought it'd be really kind of cool and a nice nod to a sort of 70s original manufacturer design if we actually had a completely enclosed sort of tin air cleaner, as I suppose they'd call them. And I spotted that the original sort of 68, 69 Camaros had quite a cool pressed metal air cleaner with sort of twin oval snorkels on it. I took a bit of a gamble that would probably be very close to the right fit sort of size in terms of the engine bay. Got one of those over here, and yes, it's absolutely perfect. The sort of base plate design wasn't quite the right depth, and the hole size was not quite right for our throttle body. But because I already had the Edelbrock filter for it, what we've done is we've basically cut out the bottom of the new Camaro air cleaner, spot welded in the base plate from the Edelbrock one, and that's just absolutely spot on now. So we're going to do the paintwork on that, but once the whole engine's together with the cam covers on and that on, I just think it's going to look absolutely amazing now. Like, it's just a proper 70s looking engine bay. So yeah, I think I'm basically with that done, I'm up to driving it. Oh, and the other thing that was leading up to that, James has been doing the tracking. So yeah, we've got the sort of everything set up and centralised in terms of all the tie rods. There's not an enormous amount of adjustment, it's basically the toe, but we want to make sure that we've got the same amount each way available steering wise, so it's kind of centralising the steering box first, so it's in the middle of its pitman arm travel, and then setting everything up, setting the drag link up to then centralise the wheels and then set the toe dead ahead. And I think the last thing we've got to do is just set the steering wheel central. Once I've trundled it around the yard, I can just pull it up with it going straight forward, and we'll just reset the steering wheel angle. But yeah, other than that, I'm good to go on that. So yeah, I think that's probably a pretty good summary. The only other thing actually that's just popped into my head is that Luke has been doing some design work on bits for the Allegro, which Nat may not have mentioned. George is also on with Allegro Bodywork design. So Luke's done he's just working on the door handle design. Door handles are actually quite cool. They're kind of a flat piece with a flat flap that lifts out, which is, I think, similar to a lot of other British stuff. I think they're the same as the Range Rover Classic ones. I'm looking over there because Nat's Range Rover's over there. But even on the sort of the Range Rover ones and the modern reproduction ones, the quality is not amazing. So we were thinking it would just be nice to do a machined version of that. So we're keeping it very similar to the original design. We will use the original components that move on the back and the original lock barrels, but we're going to just make the housing out of machined aluminium, so we can give it it'll just be a higher quality, crisper finish. We can give it whatever anodised finish we want, and we're confident in the grade of the aluminium that it'll work nicely. So he's been on with those. C-Pill events, I think we showed before, offered them up, 3D print, offered it up to the car. Wanted to do just a couple of very minor changes, just thin it out slightly. It looked a little bit bulky, but the overall design looked great, so that was good. And then George has been working on the body design. We showed a little glimmer of that last week, and I think there was a couple of negative comments about it on the comments, but possibly just the angle we showed at and the stage he was at that time. I'm incredibly happy with how it's looking. It's further down the line now. The arch shapes are pretty much there. There's a little bit of refinement to do here and there, but the basic shape of the arches is good. We've also brought into the model Luke's grille design. We've just scanned the bumpers so we could bring them into the design and work out whether we're going to use standards, which I think we are. We're going to use standard bumpers, reprofile the ends of them and refinish them. But yeah, as an overall look, I think it's looking absolutely amazing. So it's kind of going through refining the details now, getting the shape exactly right, and then taking it the next step from a model where the shape's roughly right to actually enough detail on there to literally machine the moulds for the carbon panels straight from the CAD. So that's obviously, that takes it to another level again, because there's a lot of detail in terms of the edges of the panels and things. So that'll be what George is on with for a while now, I would imagine. And on that note, I think I'm going to leave it. I'm going to Goodwood Festival of Speed, so I might try and get a couple of shots there, although excitement will probably kick in and mean I don't. But either way, we'll see you next week.